the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. So at this point, they've got the early drummers, and who would you say their early musical influences were?
The idea that Kurt had was he wondered to his friend, what would happen if there was a band that mixed the Beatles and Black Sabbath? And that's what he was shooting for. Another big influence was a band from nearby Montesano called the Melvins. Mm-hmm. And they were a huge influence on Nirvana and Kurt and Chris. And actually one of their later drummers too loved the Melvins. So the Melvins were one of the pioneers of something called grunge, which fixed a kind of punk sensibility to a really slowed down, super heavy sound that was kind of metal, but not really. Mm-hmm. And that in turn held back to later era Black Flag, who had started off as really fast hardcore. And then just to mess with people's heads, they started playing really slow kind of metallic music. And that was actually very influential, not just on the Melvins, but also to the grunge scene in Seattle.
It was an interesting time, that sort of late 80s, because you had those hair metal bands, that sort of California, LA scene, which I know Kurt hated. And you kind of had that heavy rock, and here these guys come along and, there's no pastel colors and big hair or any of that. It's more, like you said, the punk sensibility, but punk not being overly melodic. I guess that's where Kurt said, we got to combine sort of the classic rock melodies with that sort of harder sound. Would that be correct?
Sure. Bear in mind, you had asked what music, Kurt was listening to. Kurt started off really being into the Beatles and the Monkees. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get much more pop than that. So He got an ear for melody. Later on, as he became a teen, he got into hard rock and metal. And so, Nirvana is just a hybrid of those two things. Like I said, the Beatles meets Black Sabbath.
Yeah, that's a great sort of description. Those first gigs that they did, that Seattle scene that ultimately they became part of with, I guess, Soundgarden was part of that, and some other bands. Soundgarden actually seemed like they were ahead of Nirvana at the time. Would that be fair in saying?
Yes, Soundgarden was on a very influential record called Deep Six that was, kind of considered the seminal grunge record. And who else was on that? Melvins actually were on that. I think Green River and a few other bands. Actually, a post-punk Seattle band called U-Men were also on that record. Right. Skinyard, I think, was on that record. And
you mentioned a band called Mudhoney in your book as well. Were they part of that scene?
Mudhoney absolutely was the flagship, Seattle grunge band. A little later on, they kind of split off from a band called Green River, and so it was Steve Turner on guitar and Mark Arm vocals and guitar, splitting off from Green River to form Mudhoney, and then a couple other guys split off from Green River to eventually form Pearl Jam. Seattle was, at the time, way off the media radar. No one cared about Seattle. It was where they cut down trees and build airplanes. And it was not, a lot of bands didn't even go through there on tour. It was just so people could do whatever they wanted. Mm-hmm. And they built up a very firm community in there.
Sorry? That's really interesting. So you're saying that it became kind of a little innovative hub in its own sense because it was off the radar. That's interesting.
Yeah. No one was paying attention. There was no stakes. There were no, precious few A&R scouts heading up to Seattle to check out bands. So people just did whatever they wanted. And the local bands, local fans and bands were, very supportive of each other. And it was a cool scene. A pivotal thing that was recording a demo at a place called Reciprocal Studios in Seattle. That was this tiny triangular studio in Ballard, and the Ballard section of Seattle. And they recorded with this guy, Jack Andino, who just happened to be the godfather of grunge. And he heard this tape, he recorded it, and he loved it so much, he handed it to Jonathan Poneman, who had recently joined his friend Bruce Pavitt in starting a label called Sub Pop. And he said, you got to hear this band. They're really great. And Jonathan loved the tape and pursued Nirvana and signed them. And that was a really, really pivotal thing that happened. So that's how Nirvana made it to Sub Pop. And that was the one crucial stop on the road to superstardom.
So that would have been 1988-ish, I guess?
Yeah.
That demo?
Yeah, that was actually the recording date. It was January 23rd, 1988. And then a couple of gentlemen started a label called Sub Pop, and that was Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman. And they recognized the talent there and very expertly exploited it. And they were kind of brilliant at that. And, the rest is history.
And they signed Nirvana in, was it 88 or 89?
I think Sub Pop signed Nirvana in 1988 for a single called Love Buzz. And they covered, that was a cover of a very minor pop hit song, kind of faux psychedelic tune by the Shocking Blue, who also actually had a big hit with the song Venus. But I'm sure that Nirvana knew about that song from just thrift shopping. They probably just picked up the record and thought, hey, that's cool. Let's check that out. And they wound up covering it. Their first single was called Love Buzz. Yeah, and it was by Shocking Blue, who was a Dutch band. And they had a hit, like a really massive worldwide pop hit in 1970 called Venus. And that was actually later covered by Bananarama. And they also had a big hit.
Yeah, that was a huge hit for Bananarama in the early 80s.
Yeah, I think it actually might have been an even bigger hit originally. I think that was like a global hit.
Okay, interesting. That leads us to album 1, Bleach. What are your thoughts on that album? Like, the sound is pretty heavy, man. Like on that album.
Yeah, well, that was the heaviness of Bleach was brought about by that element of Black Sabbath. That sludgy, churning sound that Black Sabbath had. It also was because in the meantime, Nirvana had picked up a pretty permanent drummer named Chad Channing. Channing lived in Bainbridge Island, which is, it's west of Seattle, and it's actually an island. It's a whole different universe from where Chris and Kurt came from. And he was really driven. He was a very good drummer, invented really cool parts, was a songwriter himself, could play guitar and other instruments. So he was a real musician, and he really upped their game musically and just in terms of just discipline. They worked really, really hard, and they made a really good record in Bleach.
Right. And of course, Bleach has that song about a girl, which I guess was Kurt writing about one of his girlfriends at the time. Is that correct in saying? Yes,
that was basically about Tracy Marander, who was kind of, his patron.
Yeah.
Kurt, was averse to work, and he and Tracy became an item, and she decided to support his artistic life. And it certainly seems like he goofed off a lot, but he also took full advantage of it. He wrote a lot of songs, made a lot of visual art, paintings and sculpture and video art and things. And he, to his credit and to hers, he made the most of it. And Tracy Miranda is a really key part of that story.
Mm-hmm. I read that she didn't know that song was about her till she read it in your book.
Yeah. I guess she was the last to know. But that was a really interesting song because amid all that grinding, Black Sabbath-y grunge on that record, all the heaviness and distortion was this almost Beatle-esque kind of song. And when I heard Bleach, that song really jumped out. I thought there was such an anomaly. And I thought, wow, this guy who's making this other music is also capable of making such a sweet, melodic, pop song.
Yeah.
And
which ultimately became their differentiator. I mean, that song was a prelude to what was to come, wasn't it?
Correct. Yes. That was the differentiation. A lot of the other flagship Seattle grunge bands just didn't have that pop sensibility. Mudhoney sounded, they were kind of more in the Stooges vein, Soundgarden more in the maybe a Led Zeppelin-y vein with touches of the Beatles. Pearl Jam, more like a classic 70s hard rock vibe. Certainly, all those bands were certainly capable of a catchy song now and then, but nowhere near like what Kurt was capable of.
Yeah. If you listen, folks, to that album and you start out with songs like Blue and Floyd the Barber, and then you get to this third song that Michael referenced about a girl, you just kind of like are stunned by the change, as Michael said. So it's a real precursor to what was to come. What was the reaction to that album? Did it take a while? Did it hit? Like Seattle starts to become this place and discovered at some point, but how was Bleach received?
Bleach was received well. Nirvana did a lot of touring, playing like small clubs around the country, and then eventually some international touring. They were definitely buoyed by the explosion of the first grunge explosion. The English music papers loved all the Seattle bands, and they benefited from that. So, things were going pretty well for Nirvana.